Welcome back to another episode with ByrdAdatto. Today we're going to talk about something which we talked a lot about, which is really talking about your employee safety has been something that has come up over and over again. We've talked about that on OSHA and other things that you have to do to help protect them. And because of that, a lot of our clients are having people work from home, or otherwise known as telecommuting. And as employers continue to allow their employees to work from home, even with the economy reopening, we want to kind of take a little pause and re-examine the concept of employees working from home and understanding the impact it has on your business as to actually where they reside. And to get going, today we have a special guest. Michael, please introduce our special guest.
Today joining us is Robert Fisher. Now, Robert is the first attorney at ByrdAdatto who came straight out of law school. So he has never worked at a different law firm. He joined us right at the very beginning when we had 5 attorneys, and so he has either been trained wonderfully or he's got some ground to make up. We'll let you all to decide. But Robert went to University of Georgia undergrad and SMU Law School, and does a ton of our M&A work. For those of you who have had us help on those things, I'm sure you've worked with Robert, and look forward to having you with us today.
Glad to be here.
Awesome, and thanks for joining us, Robert, being the OG apparently of the group. Robert, I'm going to jump back to 1945, and it sounds weird that I'm going to be talking about a Supreme Court case in 1945, but most lawyers, forgive us, audience who's not, when we started law school, there's a case you learn called International Shoe versus Washington. Now, this case is taught because it has to do with whether or not a corporation that's not present in a state and has non-residents working for that corporation, do they establish a minimum contacts? And so it sounds weird, but Robert, let's kind of jump into it. What does this case have to do with today's video and telecommuting?
Yeah, so International Shoe was a company that it was a Delaware entity that was home-based in Missouri. So, those of us thinking back to, law, since we're bringing up law school, Professor Adatto over here asking me to stand up and recite the facts of the case, that I haven't thought of since 1 year of Civ Pro. But the case here, they were a Missouri company that had a sales force in Washington, but they had purposefully structured it to deal with, trying to avoid paying taxes and doing business in the state of Washington. And so they had this sales force that would go out and solicit orders, but they wouldn't actually sell anything, and they would just return all the orders back to the home base in Missouri, where they would then process the orders and fill them there, with the whole idea of trying to avoid paying taxes. Well, Washington didn't really like this a whole lot, and the key aspect here was they wanted them to pay into Washington's unemployment fund for having employees, in that state. And so the Supreme Court basically, through this case, established the test that was called the minimum contacts, which, was kind of, looking the phrase that they like to use is systematic and continuous presence in a state. And basically they wanted to determine, does Washington have the authority to sue this company and force them to, to put their personal jurisdiction over them and force them to pay the taxes that were owed in that state, which they said they were in that case. So, minimum contacts, the way it translates now is that a lot of companies have employees working from home instead of at their corporate headquarters or at, wherever their office may be. So especially if you're on a border city, in Texas, let's say you're out of Houston or, even closer like Longview or something, and you've got employees that live in Shreveport, or, you're in North Texas and have employees in Oklahoma. Up north where the states are all crowded together, you're New York, you've got employees that commute in from New Jersey, or anywhere up in the tri-state area. All of a sudden you have mass employees working in other states you may not have had before, and that can lead to potential liability, or you needing to be registered in that state to do business or pay taxes or whatnot, because now you have a presence in a state that you previously didn't.
Yeah, and I think, Michael, think about this. We have a case 1945 or so, wherever the year it was, but a Supreme Court case that wasn't looking at telecommuting. So let's really talk about the telecommuting pieces. As Robert was kind of addressing, we're bringing telecommuting into this Supreme Court case.
I'm still recovering from the post-traumatic stress I felt from listening to a law school case be discussed. And I'm sure that our audience is as mesmerized as we were back in first year of law school. I'll try to make it a little bit, the application a little bit more relevant to our audience, and that's that with telecommuting, an interesting thing we saw this week is that Airbnb rentals are up right now, and so people are working from home, and that raises natural issues. And to Robert's point, like in a tri-state area, you have issues. You just compound that with now people are like, well, I can work from home, I can work from anywhere, and I'm just going to go and hang out in California for the next 4 months and plug in from Wi-Fi and work from there. And so even those people that may be in the middle of a huge state like us in Dallas, Texas, it can all of a sudden become an issue if you don't have processes in place for what you allow with remote telecommuting, and then it's just so important to understand what the implications are if you are deemed to have employees in another state.
And so, Robert, based off that, we have a case that we can look to from the Supreme Court. But what are other states typically looking at when they're trying to figure out whether or not you have a presence in their state?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the states don't want to be super helpful with this, and the vast majority, if not every state, I'm not sure I've ever come across one that didn't. They define, when you go to you go Google or type in or whatever, trying to figure out what is the definition of doing business in a state, they always phrase it as, well, it's anything, potentially it's going to be a case-by-case analysis, but here are a few things that are definitively not doing business in this state. And that's all the guidance they give you, because that allows them, a much broader scope to be like, okay, well, this is, to have a, inclusive versus exclusive, so that kind of mentality. So, a lot of times they'll say, I know Texas and Louisiana track each other pretty closely, where some examples of things that aren't doing in the state is just, simply owning property if you're not, pushing any revenue through it. Just having a bank account in the state isn't considered doing business. But with the telecommuting issue, that's where the employees, it does matter, because, and especially not just from the doing business side, but from a tax side is, if you've got an employee that's providing services in that state may want to, say that person needs to pay income tax in that state or something. So, you're in a state like Texas that doesn't have, state withholding an income tax, and all of a sudden you've got employees in somewhere that does, you've got something else you have to deal with here. So the states are going to be looking at, how large of an impact is there, how many employees, how much, they may not want to admit it straight up. They're looking at how much money's moving through their state, because if the state feels like they're owed a substantial amount of tax for something, or, that they, you don't have a registered agent in that state because you're not registered there, so they have no way to reach you to serve it, to issue service, things like that. They're really going to be looking at the volume of things. I think a lot of states are being pretty understanding with the current situation, in that it's temporary and not permanent. I know Pennsylvania, Indiana, New Jersey, Mississippi, they've all already come out and said that they're not going to expect any temporary employees that are working from home. They're waiving all of their income tax requirements for those. But Governor Cuomo in New York has already come out. He stated at the beginning of May, all those health workers that went up to volunteer in all those hospitals up there, they have to pay New York income tax for everything that they've earned while helping through this crisis. And so it's really going to be a state-by-state basis on what they want to enforce, and how strictly they want to follow their own rules.
I'll just add, and we don't have time to get into it too deeply today, but if you have a lot of employees in another state, and it's somehow you rise to the level that you're doing business in that state, you may have to register your business entity in that state as a foreign entity. And though it's a pretty easy process, there can be pretty decent sized fees that accrue on an annual basis that go with being registered as a foreign entity in a state. And so you definitely want to, as this progresses, if it becomes an issue for your business, be talking to your CPA and even your legal counsel to see if this is a step that needs to be taken.
Yeah, and I think, Robert, you've dealt with this with a lot of our clients before, and I think Michael hit the most important piece is the registration of actually being a foreign filing is probably the easy thing. It's a secondary piece, which is if you've been there for a long period of time and you didn't let the state know, there tends to be pretty stiff penalties associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, I know in the state of Texas, they require you to pay, I think the registration fee is $750. And if you've been here for a number of years, you're going to have to pay that for every single year that you've been here that you didn't register, that they find. So the fees can add up pretty quickly. And then, outside of just the registration piece, which is, kind of similar in most states, just filing a certificate of formation. Like we said, you got to check with that state's, whether it's a controller or a Department of Revenue or things like that, because there may be additional registrations needed, based on the employee side of things. You got to be registered with their tax section to make sure that you're paying all the taxes that are owed in that state.
Well, gentlemen, this is great. Any last thoughts before we move off this topic?
No.
I just think as a history buff, it's interesting that the original case was based off of states needing money, in a post-depression thing. And I think a lot of states are hurting right now. So I'm not trying to be an alarmist, but I would urge companies to pay attention, because certain states that are cash strapped may be looking as this a kind of way to recover some tax revenue.
Right. And I completely agree with that statement, Robert. And I also completely agree with you, Michael, as that if you do have a telecommuting process, make sure that you understand where your employees reside, because all of that, if you think you're just all your employees in the same state, will be triggered if all of a sudden they do kind of move to another state or work there for several months, and the next thing you know, you're present in that state. So I think that's all the time we have, guys. Thanks again, Robert, for being here.
Sure thing.
Michael, good to see you.
Thank you.
And we look forward to having the next episode.